Welcome to the Region Free Gamers podcast. Today, we're talking Fire Emblem and its greatest hero, Marth. Or is it Mars?
I am Mars. Mars Lowell, heir to the throne of Thracia.
The son of King Cornelius? You are truly he?
Yes.
Welcome, everybody, back to the Region Free Gamers podcast, the podcast that is fluent in gaming. Arnie here, taking over hosting duties alongside, strangely enough, my singular co-host for today, from the Great White North, we the North. Paul, how are you doing?
Oh man, I'm doing great. Did you hear that? The listeners got a triple welcome at the beginning. That means it's going to be a really special show.
I know. Well, here's the thing, is we've done this once before for Advance Wars, and I feel like this is now our thing. Like, intelligent systems is our thing, because what we're going to be talking about today is Fire Emblem.
Yeah, it's great. We've got the two least intelligent members of the Region Free Gamers podcast talking about intelligent systems. It's going to be great.
See, this is, and I agree with you wholeheartedly. One thing I do want to say to our listeners, before I forget, because I'm not going to forget, I'm going to say it every time, is please, if you're listening to this, go write us a review on iTunes and rate us. It's super important, and I can't stress this enough. I know you're out there. I know you're listening. I know how many people download this show, and the amount of reviews that we have is not commensurate to that amount of people. So I want to set a goal. We have 13 reviews on the North American iTunes.
Oh, sweet.
I want it to be 20. I feel like that's a realistic goal. And I think if we don't get to 20 by the time we record our next episode, which is tomorrow, I'm going to fire Paul.
What?
Yes.
Oh, dude, I thought you were totally going to be like, it will bring dishonor on my family, and I will have to, perhaps do something drastic. I don't even want to say it out loud now that I think about it. I can't lose you, Arnie. We need you for this show.
No, I won't fire Paul, but I feel like we need to do something to get the listeners out there and reviewing our podcast. But aside from that, all that aside, we're going to be talking about Fire Emblem. And I've realized that I'm the sort of person that whenever I set out to make one of these episodes, that person who like eats with their eyes, and then by the time that like they've actually eaten a meal, they feel like dying. Like that's me, because I'm like, oh, we should do an episode about Fire Emblem. That'll be great. And then I write an outline of like 16 games, and I'm like, this was a terrible idea.
Oh my god, what a dude. What? it's gonna I was about to say what a shit show, but no, it's gonna be a great show, trust me. Like we're good to go on this. But yeah, like, and the worst part is that like I feel like, and I don't actually watch when Ozzy writes an outline for us, but I feel like it's a tight, focused effort.
I know.
And when you and I write a Fire Emblem outline, it takes like 5 minutes, and then we start watching the Fire Emblem anime for like no reason.
That's actually a more accurate description of my writing process than you might realize.
Yeah, and then we get like 4 hours sleep, because like the night before we're all like, holy shit, did you know about this? Oh my god, did you know about this? We have to share that.
Yeah,
and then,
exactly.
And so now here we are, and we're all like hopped up on caffeine.
Oh my god. So I think it's fair to say that the same disclaimer we gave for Advance Wars applies here, where it's either going to be a great episode or it's going to be an absolute dumpster fire. In either case, I feel like people will be entertained one way or the other.
Yes, exactly. Right. I'm still high, because at the time of this recording, the Toronto Raptors, my beloved basketball team, went up 3-1 on the hated evil Golden State Warriors. And I'm still riding high. I couldn't even, dude, I could barely like get to sleep last night. I was so hyped.
It's insane. And I mean, not to completely date this episode, because by the time of release, they may already be champions, or they may have suffered the most crushing defeat in the history of Canadian sports, probably.
Probably. That's my expectation, is that they'll blow the 3-1 lead.
I know. You've been so negative about this entire series the entire time.
You don't understand, dude. You don't understand what it's like growing up as a sports fan in Toronto. It is just crushing defeat after crushing defeat. Anybody listening in like Minnesota understands what we're going through. Like, I feel bad for the people of Minnesota, for example, right?
Yeah.
You know, they lose their hockey team, and boy, am I ever dating myself. And then you have like crushing Viking defeat after crushing Viking defeat. This is Toronto. This is like growing up as a Maple Leaf fan.
Yeah.
Watching Vince Carter leave and say peace and heading to the net. Like, it's just, you know, calamity after calamity. So yeah, they're up 3-1. Awesome. You know, let's get that crushing defeat out of the way finally, so I can move on with my life and get rid of this nasty hope. I don't like this hope that I have. You know, it's not becoming of a Toronto basketball fan.
That is true. I will say that I think if they do it, if they do win, regardless of if it's in 5, 6, 7 games, I think that Kawhi Leonard automatically becomes like the greatest Canadian to have ever lived.
Yes.
Even though he's not Canadian.
Even though he's not Canadian. No, he will be. He's going to head over to Ottawa, and our dashing Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, will make him like, you know, he'll grab his sword and then touch each shoulder and dub him an honorary Canada man. It'll be great.
What a as I fuck it up, what a nice transition into Fire Emblem.
Indeed. Justin Trudeau's sword.
The most
Fire
medieval
Emblem.
of games. I feel like Justin Trudeau's sword is the Fire Emblem of Canada.
Yeah. I was going to say Justin Trudeau's sword is perhaps the title of an unsavory movie. But we're going to like totally go off the rails if I go down that road.
Oh my god. So let's just dive right in. So the first thing that I think we wanted to talk about right off the bat is, what is Fire Emblem? And at its core, Fire Emblem, much like Advance Wars, is a turn-based strategy RPG. There is much more of a focus on the RPG part of that statement in Fire Emblem, but there are specific notable aspects that fans sort of recognize Fire Emblem as a series being built on. So one of the biggest is the weapons triangle. Which is basically how Fire Emblem's combat has sort of evolved and is now like the staple of the series. The weapons triangle, basically, to put it in simplest terms, is a rock, paper, scissors mechanic for weapons that are equipped to your units. So, and I think this is a universal truth for any situation. Lances are better than swords. Swords are better than axes, and axes are better than lance.
Dude, I was walking down the street the other day, and some jabroni came at me with an axe, and I was like, "No, bro!" I pulled out my sword, and he was like, "All right, I get it," and then he backed off.
Yeah, people just recognize that as like the standard of all weaponry.
Absolutely.
And I think in specific Fire Emblem games, there's also a similar breakdown in Magic, but I think, if I'm not mistaken, Magic changes in different games. Like, there's not always the same 3 types of Magic. I know that the one I remember the most is Fire, Lightning, Wind, and they have their own triangle that sort of works the same way that the weapons triangle does. The other big, at least to me, the other big aspect that makes Fire Emblem are character relationships. And basically what it does is you are sort of encouraged to develop relationships between characters in Fire Emblem games. You have optional conversations between characters, and this, I feel like, might be the point where you lose people. Because in some games, there's so many characters to sort of manage and, you know, sort of organize relationships the way you want them to. And I feel like that can be a little bit tedious at times, but it really is it's like such an important aspect of the series that I couldn't see the series ever not having it, if that makes sense.
It makes absolute sense. Like, the key to the relationship building in Fire Emblem is that it allows Fire Emblem to have a very large cast of characters and yet for you to give a shit about all of them to some degree, right?
Yes.
Especially when you have the games in the series where you can marry off the characters and they have kids, and then you can recruit the kids to your army, at some point in the game. Like, it's a very, very clever way of kind of just harnessing a large cast and not having a bunch of them lost in the shuffle.
Yeah. And I completely agree with you because, just like you said, having these conversations and getting to know these characters makes you attached to these characters. And in like sort of an evil way, Intelligent Systems really wants you to be attached to these characters because of the other thing that makes Fire Emblem games stand out, which is permadeath. When your characters die in battle, they are gone forever. And it's such I'm sure Fire Emblem wasn't the first game to necessarily do this. They might be, but it's such a Fire Emblem thing. Like, when I think permadeath, I think Fire Emblem. And, it's really a testament to how good these games are that this doesn't immediately turn people off from the entire experience. I feel like the first time you lose one of your characters, especially because these characters, like, level up and you customize them and you build their relationships, like, you're really getting into the nitty gritty with some of these characters. So later in games, when you have a character die because of like a critical hit or because you made a dumb mistake and they're just dead forever, it's soul crushing is the only way I can describe it.
Yeah, it's brutal.
And, I think we talked about this with Advance Wars too, but the thing with these games is, the further you go on, the larger, more complicated, and harder the battles that you're involved in become. And these can be multi-hour affairs to a degree. And so when you have a character die, when you're like, I don't know how long into a battle, the decision about whether you want to turn off the game and reload a save to try and avoid that character dying is really not easy. It really depends on who the character is, how invested you're in them, how much you care about having all of the characters by the end of the game, because that affects the relationships that you're able to make. And in later games, the sort of offspring units that you're able to get. But I remember when I first had a character die, because I came into this series after Advance Wars. So the concept of having like each unit being an individual, more or less, was already like, whoa, this is crazy. But then to have them die and then not come back for the next mission, I was like, what is going on?
What is this game doing to me?
I know.
Yeah, no, and you'll see as we go over the games that they eventually give players the option to play without permadeath.
Yeah.
I think permadeath is I think it's a relic of the era where we had fewer games to play. And so Intelligent Systems could afford to be, a little bit more rough with the players without a better way of, without a better phrase to come up with to explain it. We just had fewer options, and it was more likely that you'd play a game like Fire Emblem 5, 6, 7 times, because it might have been the only game that you had, because you're getting games like once or twice a year or something like that on special occasions.
Yeah. And I do agree with you to an extent that I think it is a sort of sign of the times, but I think that it adds weight. There is stakes attached to all this development and getting attached to these characters that I feel like permadeath is, I don't know, to me specifically, I like it in the sense that it's not just, it gives you something else to sort of be concerned about if the game is maybe not as challenging to you as it would normally be. Like, if you're a veteran of strategy RPGs, like, the risk of permadeath, I think, always keeps people on their toes.
Yeah, I like it as well. It's the same reason that I like roguelikes. I like anything in a game that raises the stakes.
Yeah.
Right? When I want to be afraid of losing, you know what I mean? Because otherwise you're just kind of like herp-de-derp going through the game, and, it could be fun, we don't play games that aren't fun, But something like permadeath, it really raises the stakes, gets you kind of a little bit more focused. And when the computer crits you, it just makes you so angry. And what other game can make you that? Maybe if you're playing online and you've lost 10 times at Street Fighter 5, right?
Yeah.
That's a whole other thing. But that one moment where you're 90% to hit and your character misses and you're oh my God. Yep. It's excruciating, but at least you're feeling something.
Yeah. There's Fire Emblem tilt. I've been very tilted by this game multiple times.
Oh yeah.
And it's exactly what you said. Like sometimes things just don't work out, even when they should, by all rights, have worked out perfectly. And when that happens, like you just watch like hours of your life just wasting away as your character gets destroyed by some rando who should have never killed you.
Yes, exactly.
But before like my blood pressure shoots up, I just want to give people a small overview of the series. So those are the things that make Fire Emblem, in my opinion. Like, obviously there are other things, but I think these are the biggest ones.
Yeah.
And I'm going to be saying this a lot because this is another strategy RPG developed by Intelligent Systems and published by Nintendo. So in my mind, the comparison to Advance Wars is inevitable. But I'm going to try to keep it to a minimum. I will say right now, controversial opinion, and I'm sure we'll talk about this at the end of the episode, I prefer Advance Wars.
Oh my God, you're fired.
I prefer Advance Wars to Fire Emblem because Advance Wars has fucking tanks. Fire Emblem doesn't have tanks. They've never had tanks. And that's unacceptable to me.
And the great thing about that, nobody can argue with you.
I know.
Nobody can say, well, hey, Arnie, Fire Emblem has tanks too. No, they don't. So you win.
I think I do love this series, but I think part of me has always been bitter that this was the Intelligent Systems series that lived on while Advance Wars died. And I refuse to blame that on the fact that Advance Wars just stopped being as good as I think it is.
Well, they each have a different appeal.
Yeah.
And and we'll get into that as we go along.
But yeah, like I said, Fire Emblem developed by Intelligent Systems, published by Nintendo. The first game in the series was actually developed as a Dojin project, Dojin project. Yeah,
you got
that's
it.
correct.
You got it.
By series creator Shozu Kaga, and 3 other developers. Basically, they were working on it in their spare time. And can I just say, I know we've interjected a lot, but can I just say how many video games start off with like, yeah, the first one was just like 4 people fucking around in their spare time, and then they just created like one of the greatest video games of all time?
Oh my God.
Is there another medium where that happens? Like, is somebody like, yeah, Quentin Tarantino was just like shooting home video, and then all of a sudden it was Pulp Fiction?
Yeah, not to the degree of Pulp Fiction. I mean, you got indie movies, like you have Clerks, right? Clerks
true.
was made by like, a dude and some actors. And it was very,
fair point.
Yeah, but like, it's apples and oranges, right? Because this is the beginning of an entirely, I shouldn't say new medium. It was still like this video game medium was still in its childlike state, right? Yeah. Yet to kind of grow into what it is now. And so back then, the development teams were super small, and some dude in his spare time could be like, yeah, I'm going to make this game. And then, oh, by the way, it's going to spawn a franchise that sells millions of copies in, 30 years. So
exactly.
Yeah.
But I think if there's one thing people could take away from this episode, it's that Fire Emblem is the Clerks of video games. If Clerks was like Avatar or something.
Wow, these are not a stretch at all, Arnie.
But yeah, so initially developed as a Dojin project, but obviously became like the defining series that it is today, consisting of 16 games total. We'll be mentioning all of them. I'll say right off the bat, like 19 minutes into this, we're not going to be talking about the story of most of these games. We're not going to go super in depth on them because that would involve like a 16-hour podcast.
Yeah, no, this is more about like, the series and its ups and downs and
Yeah.
and so on and so forth.
Yeah. But obviously there's a ton of games to get to. I will say Kaga led the development of every game until Thracia 776, which we'll get to later. But why I thought this was interesting was because when you have a creator like that, I feel like a lot of the time they stick with that creation throughout its entire run. Or if they don't, the series sort of suffers in the wake of their departure. I'm thinking like Hideo Kojima, Metal Gear Solid sort of thing.
Yeah.
But I feel like Fire Emblem is one of those rare cases where I think Kaga's departure did have an effect on the series, but it sort of overcame that and went on to become like, you know, even bigger than what it was when he was at the helm.
Yes.
But after he left Intelligent Systems, he formed his own studio, Turnanog, who developed a game called Tear Ring Saga. The reason I bring this up is because there's a funny story where Tear Ring Saga is a tactical RPG that closely resembles Fire Emblem, surprisingly enough. They were developing to release on the Sony PlayStation, and if you'll remember, like, Sony and Nintendo have always had a rivalry, but I feel like the PlayStation 1 was like the peak of this because the Nintendo PlayStation had fallen through and Sony was now, you know, releasing their own standalone console to directly compete with Nintendo. So while they were developing Tear Ring Saga, the development team was receiving pressure from Nintendo because Nintendo felt that the game's presentation and gameplay, along with the art, which I think is the biggest thing here, because it was done by Mayumi Hirota, who had done the art for Fire Emblem Thracia 776, sort of infringed on their Fire Emblem copyright. Now, I know our listeners will not be able to see this, but I highly recommend you look up the cover art for Tear Ring Saga. I've included it in our notes, along with the cover art for Fire Emblem Thracia 776. And I just want you to tell me if you think this looks similar at all, Paul.
Well, I mean, it's the same, right? Like, especially the main hero. Like, it is from like down to the hairstyle and the costume and everything. Like, it is the same dude. So, like, I mean, I get it, Nintendo, and especially because like this game originally, Tear Ring Saga. I mean, Kaga originally wanted to call it Emblem Saga.
Yes.
I mean, come on, dude.
You got to try a little harder than that.
You have to try a little bit harder. Like, you're basically asking for it at this point.
Yeah.
And so Kaga did relent and, you know, change the name to Tear Ring Saga because he was afraid of litigation from Nintendo. Mm-hmm. And then Nintendo was like, okay, thanks for changing the name. We'll see you in court anyway.
Yeah, exactly. Nintendo did not care. By what I could tell, the game was actually a success and did receive a full translation in 2016, like a full fan translation. So if you're interested in playing it, go do it because it shouldn't be that hard. There was a Japanese-only sequel called Berwitch Saga, which released on the PS2 in 2005. And these were the only two games that Kaga's studio ever developed. Kaga then took a hiatus from video games, and we've talked about this before, how people in video games just disappear. But he reemerged in 2016 when he released Vestaria Saga, which is an indie RPG, an indie strategy RPG in the vein of Fire Emblem. So he's still, you know, it seems like he's still doing stuff. And I think Vestaria Saga is just free online. I don't know if there's a translation patch for it, though. But if you're interested, go check it out.
Yeah, absolutely.
So getting into the early years, here's where things become a little weird. Advance Wars had a sort of similar trajectory where a lot of the games came out in Japan before they ever reached anywhere outside of Japan. And it was mostly due to Nintendo not having faith that strategy RPGs would be successful and would sell well. Fire Emblem had a much longer, more circuitous route to actually being released overseas. But, you know, we start off with the first game, Fire Emblem Shadow of Dragon and the Blade of Light, released on the Famicom on April 20th, of 1990, for the Famicom. I just had to, because this is not the only time that they release a game on April 20th in this series. So I feel like they're doing it on purpose to a certain degree.
They must just all be stoners.
Yes, absolutely. It was, I was actually fascinated by this. So Fire Emblem was co-developed by Intelligent Systems and Nintendo R&D1, which for those of you who don't know, R&D1 is Nintendo's oldest development team, and they were headed by Gunpei Yokoi. They basically handled a lot of hardware stuff for Nintendo, and they did sort of offbeat versions of like some of their series. Like they did Super Mario Land, which is the Super Mario Game Boy game, which if you've played it is extremely weird and super cool. But yeah, they did the Game Boy, the Virtual Boy, stuff like that. They also did Metroid and Super Mario Land. So just a cool little fact that I liked. I didn't know they were involved in the development of the original Fire Emblem. Development began in 1987 when Kaga wanted to combine the strategic elements of Famicom Wars, which is the original Advance Wars series, with the characters and story of a role-playing game. Kaga's resume is essentially just Fire Emblem games and like Tear Ring Saga and its sequel. Yeah. So the man knows what he's doing. And it's crazy to think like this was something he just like said one day is like, I want to take this game because Famicom Wars to me is very like Advance Wars is sort of the yin to Fire Emblem's yang, where Advance Wars story is like not like involved pretty much at all, and you can probably skip the whole thing, whereas Fire Emblem is like the story is the thing.
Yeah, absolutely, man.
So it was interesting to see like how that process happened. Directed by Keisuke Terasaki, produced by Gunpei Yokoi. So Yokoi was involved in Fire Emblem for a long time. Music composed by Yuka Shujiyoko. She still works with Intelligent Systems, has worked on Fire Emblem, Paper Mario, and some of the Smash Brothers games she's contributed to. This is the first appearance.
I was gonna say she's like the main force behind the iconic Fire Emblem theme that we all know.
Yeah.
I don't know if it was worth interrupting you to say that, but here we are.
No, I think it's important that we talk about it. I will say first appearance of Marth, so right off the bat, probably the most important Fire Emblem character. Initial sales and reception of this game were lackluster. Critically, it was not liked at all, I don't think, or not as much as you would think. But word of mouth sort of spread, and by the end of the year, it was a commercial success on the year that it released. It is credited with influencing some of Paul's favorite games like Final Fantasy Tactics, and also Tactics Ogre and Disgaea. I can totally see that. I think that you can't really argue that since it was sort of the originator of this RPG genre per se.
Pretty much.
But, far-reaching implications.
Yeah, it is, like, it really is kind of like the OG of the strategy RPG mashup. You know what I mean? And it's brilliant, right? Like, let's take the strategy game, because you have Famicom Wars, but, it's kind of impersonal. You're using military units and so on and so forth. Yeah. But, you throw in RPG-style characters, you throw in that kind of story, and then you throw in, like, an epic theme song. By the way, you can find like vocal arrangements of the Fire Emblem theme song where there's like, the serious Japanese man saying Fire Emblem, and it's like it's so like late 80s. It's absolutely fantastic.
Amazing.
Like I have to be very careful because Nintendo might come after us for
might sue you.
Yeah, if my singing gets too good, so I purposely made it crappy so Nintendo wouldn't come after us.
Thank you for sparing us from Nintendo's wrath, and
you're welcome. You're welcome.
Bathing the listeners in your beautiful voice.
I do it for all of you.
And really the following on from the original Fire Emblem. I'm sorry. Following on from the original Fire Emblem, you see a lot more of the same gameplay mechanics sort of being iterated upon, but being refined. The exception is the immediate sequel, Fire Emblem Gaiden, released in 1992. It was the same team. Kaga took directing duty for the first time on this game, but it's not a sequel to the first game. It's its own story, and it involves some weird mechanics. It introduced a overworld you can navigate and branching class promotion, that would eventually become part of the series. The overworld, not so much. This received mixed critical reception, but was commercially successful. It's really known as the black sheep of the series. It's the Zelda 2 moment, is how I've heard it described, of Fire Emblem, which I think is really appropriate. But also, I like Zelda 2, so I mean, do I know?
Man, that sequel stuff at the time was all, like, it was borderline epidemic, right? Like, Simon's Quest, Super Mario 2, and to be fair, you know, Super Mario 2, there's a whole other story behind that.
Yeah.
But like a lot of weird sequels there. And let me tell you, the word Gaiden, for my entire life up until this week, I have not known the meaning of the word Gaiden.
Isn't it like a side story or something?
Correct. You stepped on the punchline, but that's okay.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, it just came up because, you know, we're also doing, you know, we're in the middle of doing our research for, so because the NBA finals are on now, we're kind of inspired to do a sports themed, episode. Yeah. And we're, you know, stay tuned. We're going to come up with another episode of like weird kind of sports game spin-offs, like NBA Jam and so on and so forth. And as I was researching for that episode, I happened upon Charles Barkley Shut Up and Jam Gaiden.
No way. That's not.
Dude.
That's not.
We'll talk. You and I will talk about that after the show, and then we'll be able to regale our listeners with the amazingness that is Barkley Shut Up and Jam Gaiden. But
I'm canceling the Fire Emblem episode. This is now the Charles Barkley Shut Up and Jam Gaiden episode.
So I saw the word Gaiden there, and I'm like, Gaiden again. And then when Fire Emblem Gaiden came up, I had to actually go online and look it up. And yes, you're right. The meaning is side story. So Fire Emblem side story, Charles Barkley Shut Up and Jam side story. And it really goes back, and it makes me like, ninja side story?
That's exactly what I was going to say. I feel like Ninja Gaiden ruined that word for people outside of Japan.
100%.
Because it makes no sense in that context.
Yeah. And you also have like Darius Gaiden. Correct. And I'm like, Darius side story? It's like it's a shoot 'em up with fish. Yep. What could the side story be?
I think that the way I found out about it was when I first heard of Resident Evil Gaiden on the Game Boy Color, I think.
Oh, right.
That's the one that made me look it up, because I was like, Gaiden? Like, what? But yeah, there's a bunch of these, and I think we'll discuss this on some other episode, but Ninja Gaiden, I think, is responsible for ruining that word.
Yeah, coming up on the Region Free Gamers podcast, Gaiden games.
Oh my god, no. Too many.
Anyhow.
But yes, F.E. Gaiden, side story, you know, it's influential in its own way, as we'll see later on, but we'll save that for later on in the podcast.
Yeah.
All right, and with that, before we get on into further discussion of the Famicom era games, we'll take a quick break. We'll be right back. Welcome back, everybody. Paul just beat me up while we were on break for stepping on his Gaiden punchline, but I'm back. I'm doing well.
I reached through Skype and gave Arnie the thrashing of a lifetime.
Yeah, it was traumatizing. But now we're moving on to the Super Famicom era of Fire Emblem. Cue fireworks, applause. Everybody's excited. With the first entry in that series being Fire Emblem Mystery of the Emblem. This game, I have a bone to pick with this game because, you know what? I'm just going to talk about it. So it was released in 1994. Same team. Kaga returned to the designer role with Keisuke Terasaki taking over as director. So basically the same team they had for the first game. The story of this game is divided into two distinct parts. The first part is a remake of the original Fire Emblem game, while the second part is an original story, which is a sequel to the first game. So already they're making Fire Emblem remakes, and they're 3 games into the series. But I kind of like it in this case because it gives players who didn't experience Fire Emblem on the Famicom a way to sort of do that and also play the sequel at the same time. Originally it was conceived as 2 separate projects, and then it was merged, which, thank God. I think that was the right way to play that.
Absolutely.
Because I can't imagine trying to sell people on buying the original game again and then buying the sequel if, like, you're new to the series. But here's the thing. Obviously, not being Gaiden, the gameplay sort of returned to tactical RPG roots from the first game. So, you know, it's a lot more like the original game, which makes sense because story-wise, it's also a continuation of that game. You know, unit abilities can be influenced through a support system in this game. I believe this was the first game to introduce this. It might have been in the original, but I'm not sure about that. This was the first time I heard about it. But basically what it does is when 2 characters in the story have a relationship, and those characters are next to each other on the battlefield, they boost each other's stats. This is, we talked about it in the beginning, but this is like a big Fire Emblem thing that only gets more complicated and convoluted from this point on, I think.
Yeah, this is basically the birth of the relationship system in the game, which has seen various, you know, iterations and sequels. You know, they kind of do it in different ways. Sometimes you can have kids, sometimes you can't, and so on and so forth. But basically, it kind of starts here.
Yeah. And the other big thing they did is that they lowered the difficulty to encourage new players to try the series. I think this has been an ongoing problem with, I wouldn't say problem, that's too strong of a word, but something that I see get brought up a lot with Fire Emblem is the difficulty. Eventually they introduced difficulty levels, but it always seems like there's one game that's really hard, and then there's one game that's easier, and then there's one game that's harder. I don't know what it is, if they're just like, you know, we're just going to make this game harder, or if they just never found like the perfect balance.
They're probably just responding to complaints.
Yeah.
You know, wow, this game's too hard. Okay, we'll make it easy. Wow, this game's too easy. You people don't know what you want.
I'm sorry. Are you saying that gamers don't know what they want?
No, we
exactly. That's
you guys know everything. Yeah.
Because we also have this podcast, so we know everything, Paul. Duh.
Oh, I know a few people who would disagree.
I will say my biggest fear in this entire podcasting endeavor is that at some point we'll get a listener who actually knows everything about all these games and starts like furiously commenting on every episode that we're frauds and we don't know what we're talking about.
Yeah, and then we're just completely exposed. I can't believe it hasn't happened already.
We're giving people ideas. We're going to have to delete this part. But yeah, so here's my bone to pick with this game. This game has never been released outside of Japan, and you know, the first half of the series basically just existed in Japan, but a good number of those games have been released outside of Japan via remakes now. And the ones that haven't, I understand, but this game has had so many releases. There was a DS remake called Fire Emblem New Mystery of the Emblem in 2010, which is when Fire Emblem was already being released in America, but I think sales were declining at that point, and maybe that's why this one didn't get translated. It was re-released in 2017 as part of the Japanese Super Nintendo Classic Edition, which I get not having a random Fire Emblem game in the international release of the Super Nintendo Classic, but it's still annoying. And then they also released it on the Wii, Wii U, and 3DS Virtual Console. And
Man,
none of
just
those
like rubbing it in over and over.
Exactly. And none of those Even while Fire Emblem was at the peak of its popularity, this game has never seen release outside of Japan. And that really annoys me because the first game has been remade and re-released outside of Japan. And this is the direct sequel to that game.
Yeah, it's disappointing, especially because we had a couple of opportunities where Nintendo could release it.
Yeah.
It's hard to have a bone to pick with them. Like, the SNES Classic would have been perfect, right? A new game to go with your new little mini system.
Yep.
But
it's the introduction of Fire Emblem, which was big.
But they gave us Star Fox 2.
That's true.
So it's like I can't really take them to task too much. Now, you know what? With that said, we live in an age now where you can download ROMs for these games.
Yes.
I don't encourage illegal activity. I'm just saying it's out there.
Yeah.
And there are fan translations, really good ones.
Yeah.
For Mystery of the Emblem. So if you really want to play it and you want to stick it to Nintendo because they deprived you, like new Mystery of the Emblem for the DS. Come on, guys. Like, the game is already made. You just have to localize it. And at that time, like, you're telling me that, 100,000+ units sold in North America is not going to cover your costs for localization?
That's what I'm saying. That is what I'm saying.
I'm not a business guy, but come on.
Here's the thing. So, the game was received generally well critically and sold extremely well from what I can tell. I think up to a certain point, it was the best-selling Fire Emblem game. And for a series that was Japan only, it was, it had sold like multiple hundreds of thousands of units. So it did well. And then this is essentially why I included this game at all, aside from the fact that it's a mainline Fire Emblem game. It received a 2-episode OVA adaptation in 1996. Due to poor sales, no further episodes were produced outside of these two, but it was localized. In 97, 6 years before the first Fire Emblem game released in America, or outside of Japan, this anime was localized. This anime is the first piece of Fire Emblem media to be released outside of Japan, and that's like my favorite fact of this entire episode.
It's actually kind of incredible. But I mean, like, among like kind of hardcore gamers and fans, Fire Emblem was a known quality, right?
Oh, yeah.
So I can see why AD Vision would want to release Fire Emblem in North America, because it does have some name recognition. Mm-hmm. And hey, we're both glad that they did, because like most mid-90s anime, the dubbing, hilarious.
Oh, absolutely. It's so ridiculous. I will say, for all the listeners out there who are interested, which should be every one of you. Oh, yeah. Both episodes are freely available on YouTube. Just search Fire Emblem anime. You'll find it. But yes, hilarious voice acting. And actually, you know what? I will say, as much as I make fun of it, the animation was pretty good for the time, obviously. Yeah. And the story is something that, like, had this been a 13 to 26 episode anime, I probably would have watched the entire thing. The only other big fact about this is that Marth's Japanese voice actor, that's the other thing. In the American dub, they call him Mars, not Marth.
Nice.
Which is like classic anime dubbing in the 90s. But his Japanese voice actor went on to voice him in subsequent appearance, Reed Smash. He's still the voice actor for Marth to this day. Like, in Smash Ultimate, he's the voice actor for Marth. So that guy, like, that OVA was probably the best thing that ever happened to him. I know.
Talk about unexpected returns for
kept
that.
Him employed.
Yeah.
But yeah, so then we move on to a little oddity that I just want to touch on very briefly, BS Fire Emblem. So BS Fire Emblem is a Fire Emblem game for the Satellaview peripheral. Basically, and I don't know if you've heard of this before, Paul, but it's basically like a peripheral that allowed you to stream, or I guess broadcast games to your SNES through a satellite. So there were a few releases for this. Fire Emblem was one. Zelda had one. I can't remember any of the other ones, but basically is like at certain times of the day, you would turn on your Satellaview and you could stream these games. This Fire Emblem one seems really interesting. It was the first one to have voice acting, which was streamed over the satellite. So future, like copies of the game that were recorded onto the re-recordable SNES cartridges don't have the voice acting. That I think is lost to time, or it might have been saved by like recordings that people made of it at the time. But it's an episodic, sort of episodic in nature. There were 4 episodes released between September and October of 97. The gameplay is the same, but instead of like a story that you just follow, it's waves of enemies that get thrown at you for like 3 hours. And that's basically what you do for the 4 episodes. But yeah, so moving on to the next Super Famicom game is Genealogy of the Holy War. It was released in 96, same team. They're still doing their thing. Kaga's back to direct. This is the last game that was produced by Gunpei Yokoi, because sadly he passed away in October of 97. And, you know, I think we'll do our own episode on Yokoi at some point. There's so much to talk about, but that was a big loss at the time for the industry as a whole, I would say. Here's the interesting thing about Genealogy of War. It's the first Fire Emblem game that takes place over 2 generations. So the characters that you control during the first generation, their relationships spawn units, their children, for the second generation. And their stats are all affected by which characters you've paired off. I think some characters have story relationships that you can't change, but other than that, you're able to pair off any characters you want, and you'll get different results for their offspring stats, like depending on which ones you pick, which is really cool and something that we'll talk about later with Awakening. So this is just the origin of that. And I got this quote off of Wikipedia because I found it so fascinating. The quote basically says, "The story originally had 3 acts rather than 2. The missing act would have covered the period between the first and second act, which put a more overt focus on the themes of patricide and incest." The reason I find that amazing is because this was a game released on a Nintendo console.
I know it. It's amazing. The story is actually, the story for Genealogy of the Holy War is very, you know, epic in scope, especially for that time. And the themes are very adult. The lines between good and evil are very blurred. You know, it's not like your typical, we'll say Final Fantasy game where you have your good guys and you had your bad guys and everything's very clear. No, it's very black and white. Yeah. And, like there's danger with nations using holy war as a means to kind of rile up people and like what the effects are there. Yeah. It's huge game too. Huge game, like massive world conflict. The maps are bigger. Yeah. It was really something for the time.
Yeah. I mean, if you've never played some of these games, I like obviously go play them, but reading the synopses of the stories of these games is insane. Like, you know, just thinking about this being a game, and people say this, and I find it a little bit insulting, but games meant for children, essentially. Yeah. Even though they weren't exclusively played by children, to have stories like this is crazy.
Yeah. And I mean, if I'm a game creator at that time, and I have a chance to either work on Fire Emblem or like Barbie Groom and Ride, like this is probably what I want to be doing, just saying. So I can see how the industry was starting to mature already at this point. And then, you know, we get stuff like Metal Gear Solid and so on and so forth. Yeah. And then congratulations, you have, you know, an adult medium, right? Yep. The other notable thing about Genealogy of the Holy War, first Fire Emblem game to introduce the weapon triangle that we would see in later entries. You know, everybody by now is familiar with the weapon triangle. You mentioned it earlier in the show. Yep. But yeah, it started with Genealogy of the Holy War.
Yep. Which is insane to think that like something so intrinsically tied to the series didn't start to like, what is this, the fourth entry?
Yeah, exactly. But I mean, that's how it was, right? Like there's a lot of games.
That's how it goes.
People who are used to Awakening and having all of these things like already in the game. No, it's piecemeal, right? Every game releases kind of a new system or a new quirk or tweak on the existing systems. And that's kind of the theme as we go through the series.
Yeah. And like we've said, I'm not going to say it anymore, but there is a fan translation. Go check it out. This one was also never released outside of Japan, and obviously has seen Wii U, and 3DS Virtual Console releases in Japan. I'm tired, Paul.
Stop it. Move on, Ernie.
Okay. Next game, Thracia 776. This one was released for Super Famicom 99. This one takes place during the events of Genealogy of War, to my understanding. So it's kind of like, I want to say an interquel. Like, it doesn't follow the same characters, but it's set in the same world during the same time period, I believe. This game is notable, and I feel like I've said that for everyone, but this game is notable because this is Kaga's last game before he leaves Intelligent Systems, along with Mayumi Hirota, who had been the character designer for most of these games. This game, this is what I read, is that Kaga's focus shifted to gameplay, unlike Genealogy, where story was king. So the story is a lot more tapered off, I would say, than Genealogy's is, but it also introduced the fatigue system, which is something that would come back in later entries. Basically, your characters lose energy with each action, so if your characters become fatigued, you won't be able to use them in the following chapter. This is when I start to realize that Fire Emblem, what seems like a much more simple game on the surface, really has like some deep complexity. And I think that mechanically, this one and Genealogy are where those things sort of start rolling. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. And Thracia 776, great title, by the way.
Yes.
Also known as possibly being the hardest Fire Emblem game in the entire series, or at the very least, it's like top 3. Like, the game has no mercy. Like, it sweeps the leg. Yep. And it got some flack for that, but you can see how, like, now we're in the Super Famicom. We're not even in the Super Famicom era. Like, this game was released in 99. It's probably, I'm reasonably certain it was the last officially licensed Nintendo game released for the console. The Nintendo 64 had already been out for 3 years. And then Thracia 776 comes out. But you can see how, like, there's just more, and the games get harder and harder, and then eventually they have to dial it back a bit. It's cyclical in nature.
That's right, because it was originally released as a Nintendo Power Flash cartridge, so you'd go to the store with one of your rewritable cartridges, and they'd put this game on there. But then it later received an actual release.
Yeah, and the actual release, man, let me tell you, like, I want it. Like, have you seen the collector's box? It is bonkers, man. Like, they released the collector's edition of this game. It has like 2 plushies, some cards, and it has a VHS tape with background on the story. No. It's background story specifically for the game, and which amuses me because, like, I saw that and I was like, so cool. But when Final Fantasy 15 did it, I was like, this is bullshit. I should be able to understand this story without having to watch a movie. And then I was like,
how times
have
changed.
Yeah, a bit of a hypocrite there. Expensive though, man. It was like, when I was looking at it on eBay, it's like $400 Canadian.
Jesus.
So, it's like 3 McDonald's meals in American money. Expensive.
I think the Canadian money, like the Canadian currency transfer, is my favorite running gag of this podcast.
It's the only way that I can make a very depressing thing more fun.
At least your money is colorful and enjoyable.
Oh yeah, just like Canadians themselves.
That's a very apt metaphor, I think. I like that one.
So Thracia 776, like that's the last one, and then Kaga moved on, and I'm reasonably certain, just based on interviews and so on, that he moved on because they were working, and it was officially announced, Fire Emblem 64.
Yep.
You know, that was a thing that was going to happen, and it ended up just failing and never launching.
Can I just say, really quickly, what is it about the Nintendo 64 and just having like, and I'm specifically thinking of Mother 64, just like having these games that like looked really cool at the time when they were developing, and then sort of migrating those series to the Game Boy Advance.
Yeah, I'll tell you why. It's because, look, some people are going to be upset with me, but it's because the Nintendo 64 was a giant piece of crap. is really what it comes down to. Like, you had a system that was capable of, you know, like, I'm going to say good graphics, although, you know, there's problems with the haze and fuzz in those games. Mm-hmm. But ultimately, you have a cartridge medium that just cannot handle the scope of the modern RPG at the time. Yeah. There just wasn't enough storage space. And allegedly, this is what happened to Fire Emblem 64. Kaga's working on 64, and he's like, look, Nintendo, your system sucks. Like, I can't make this game for it. And Nintendo was like, okay, well, I guess we'll just release Thracia, and then you'll be on your way because you failed. Is really what it came down to.
Yeah.
And then they sued his ass, and yeah.
I was gonna say, now I think it makes a little more sense why Tear Ring Saga maybe was so similar to Fire Emblem. Maybe he was trying to do what he couldn't do on the Nintendo 64 on the PlayStation.
Well, I mean, it's the same thing as Final Fantasy VII, right? Like, Final Fantasy VII was originally, like, they had the tech demo and everything, right? It was originally supposed to be an N64 game.
That's right.
And Square was like, look, we need more space. These cartridges aren't cutting it. Mm-hmm. And Sony came along and was like, hey, we have all the space you need. Squaresoft said, peace out to Nintendo. That was it.
I know. I respect you for not qualifying your statement as the Nintendo 64 DD was a total piece of crap.
The DD, I mean, look, too little, too late, right? Like, you want to move Fire Emblem 64 to the DD. That's all well and good. But the disc system, obviously too little, too late. Yeah. Like, you know, you have a cartridge-based system. You just can't save it with an add-on. It's just not, it's not happening. Like, look at the Sega CD, for example, right? Not the most successful, not the most successful console. I'm sure people remember it fondly. Mm-hmm. You know, but like Sewer Shark, come on now. So,
I think people try to remember Snatcher or Popful Mail rather than Sewer Shark.
Yeah, exactly. But you can't ignore that Sewer Shark happened.
Oh yeah.
But yeah, basically what they did was they booted Kaga, or Kaga left.
Yeah.
And then they took everything they made with 64 and converted it to the Binding Blade on the Game Boy Advance.
That's right. And that's the next entry on our thing. And an hour and 10 minutes into this podcast, we're finally getting to the last Japanese exclusive game, Fire Emblem The Binding Blade, released in 2002. So there was a bit of well, I guess not, because if Thracia was 2000, the break sort of explains itself with 64. But Binding Blade, first title to appear on a handheld console, which is insane to me because I've always thought of Fire Emblem as a handheld franchise, but when you look at the history, you see that no, it's the other way around. It was a console franchise first and foremost, which is kind of exactly what happened to Advance Wars, and I'm sorry to bring that back around again, but it's pretty much the same arc. You know, Famicom Wars, Super Famicom Wars were all console games, and then eventually it came to the GBA as Advance Wars. There had been a Game Boy Advance Wars, but that was sort of not the main thing they were pushing. But no, so it comes to the GBA, produced by Toru Narihiro. Is that correct?
I believe so, yeah.
Okay. And this is the first appearance of Roy. So, you know, I'm not talking about the appearances of different characters except for the big ones. So, Marth, Roy, and we'll see Ike a little bit later.
Yeah. I think the main thing we can get from the GBA games, the biggest thing we can take from them, and we don't have to go into detail on all of them, but the biggest thing we can take away from the GBA games is that this is where the series started in the US.
Yeah.
And it's funny because when we did our Advance Wars episode, I think we might have cut this out of the final episode, but you and I had a discussion on the effect of Super Smash Bros. Melee on how popular, Fire Emblem, like on Nintendo's decision to bring Fire Emblem out to the West. Yeah. And I just kind of like, you brought it up and I just kind of pooped all over you. Like, I just kind of like patted your head and I was like, oh, Arnie, you try so hard, but that's not even, that's not why it was released in the West. No, it's actually a big reason, man. Super Smash Bros. Melee for the GameCube had Marth and Roy, and players just really liked Marth and Roy.
Yep. And credit to Sakurai. He had wanted to include Marth since the original Super Smash Brothers, apparently, and Nintendo was playing the Paul in that situation and just patted his head and was like, "Nah, son." But eventually they relented by essentially what they did is they didn't remove Marth and Roy from the Japanese release, which I think was the original plan. And they were like, okay, we'll keep these two weirdos in here. And then people fell in love with those two weirdos. And that's how we sort of move on to Fire Emblem. It's known as the Blazing Blade in Japan, but in everywhere outside of Japan, just Fire Emblem. 2003 in Japan and the US, Australia got it in 2004, and Europe also got it later in 2004. This is strange to me because this game is a prequel to the Binding Blade, but Binding Blade was never released outside of Japan. So I don't know. I've never played this one personally, but I would think the story is a little weird. It's just sort of jumping in that way.
No, I played it. I had no idea at the time. Like, I played this when it was just called Fire Emblem. I was really excited because I knew for a long time that Fire Emblem was a thing that existed on the Super Famicom, and we just never got it here. It was like my video game White Whale. Oh wow! And so it came out on the Game Boy Advance, and I was super hyped for it. And it's good. It's good. The thing is that, like, you've seen the Super Famicom ones, and it's like, oh, it looks a little bit kind of toned down. So I thought it was a good game. But I actually never ended up buying the sequel, which is the Sacred Stones. That was just released a year later. Yep. And it kind of follows the whole Advance Wars thing, which is, they were reusing a lot of the artifacts and elements. So Binding Blade's development took a very long time. Like we said, it started as 64, but then Sacred Stones, bang, like they released it a year later. Yep. And it's very much like Black Hole Rising, Advance Wars Black Hole Rising, that is.
And here's the thing is, the last thing I want to say about, because I think of Fire Emblem and Sacred Stones as sort of a pair, so I like to talk about them together. Yuka Shuyoko, her last Fire Emblem game, well, not her last, but the last game that she was a composer on for Fire Emblem was Blazing Blade, or Fire Emblem. So she's the last of the original team to leave. So past this point, you get all new people. Nobody from the original Fire Emblem team is left, which is sad. But like I said, I think this is the point where you sort of start seeing how Fire Emblem sort of contracts and then expands to become like the behemoth it is today.
The contraction, like, sorry to interrupt you, but like, no. The contraction was, really with the 64, like that almost killed the series. And if Nintendo didn't have a successful handheld, we would have never seen Fire Emblem again. Yeah. There's no doubt about it. Like, this might have been its lowest point, other than perhaps the point before Awakening. Yeah. And we almost didn't see it again.
I know. And here's the thing. Sacred Stones and Fire Emblem did very well internationally, critically and commercially. We've already talked about how Super Smash Bros. Was one of the things that did it. But the other thing, Paul, do you know what it was?
Go ahead, Arnie.
It was a little plucky game known as Advance Wars.
What? I didn't see that coming.
Because Advance Wars sort of showed Nintendo, like, no, people outside of Japan do like strategy RPGs, and they can work. And so that sort of motivated them to be like, well, if Advance Wars can work, Fire Emblem can definitely work. because they were around this time, like RPGs were established now in America, or sorry, outside of Japan, and they had been for a while. So I can only imagine that the idea of having a Advance Wars like game with RPG elements, they were like, this is going to be money in the bank. And it was.
Yeah, pretty much. Like, it's hilarious. Like, you know, for the players who love Fire Emblem and enjoy it now, it's so bizarre, but you thank Super Smash Brothers and Advance Wars for ultimately for bringing it over.
That's right.
Yeah, really cool little thing. And ultimately Advance Wars is the one that kind of lost in the end. But we've mentioned, that's like the 20th time we've mentioned that now. Just cannot hide.
It'll never get
hide
old.
the disappointment. But anyhow, we should probably take a break, Arnie.
Yeah, we will be taking a break, and we'll be coming back with, you know, the latter half of the history of Fire Emblem. So stay tuned for that. And we're back, folks. So now we sort of move into, they were on console, they were on handhelds, now they're back on consoles, baby. Fire Emblem can't make up its mind about where it wants to be. But so here we see Path of Radiance. It's the GameCube release for Fire Emblem, the only GameCube release for Fire Emblem, released in Japan in April 20th. Nice.
Of course.
Of 2005. And internationally, you know, for the rest of 2005 in various stages. Is the first home console release since Thracia 776. And I gotta say, you know, I had said before, like, I think of Fire Emblem as a handheld series. And I think part of that is because I just enjoy these types of games on handheld consoles more. Like, I think they lend themselves more to being sort of an on-the-go thing.
Yeah, and funnily enough, the producers of Fire Emblem disagree with you. They've always kind of seen it as a console game, but you know, after the Super Famicom era, definitely the most success was seen on handheld consoles.
Yeah, and I could not disagree with them more, and I think that they should take my advice as somebody who's never made a game in their entire life. But this is the first entry to feature. That's a hard word. 3D graphics.
2 syllables.
Stop it, Paul. This is the first game to feature 3D graphics, full motion cutscenes, and voice acting, not counting the Satellaview entry, but that was sort of streamed alongside the game. This is integrated into it. The transition to 3D was difficult for the development team, apparently. They had a really hard time sort of making this a 3D game. And knowing the history of the 64 development, that is not surprising, right? Like,
no.
It just seems like for some reason the aspects of Fire Emblem were really hard to initially move into that 3D era. And, you know, I've heard people say, like, this game was criticized for not looking good or being ugly. I kind of disagree. Based on what I've seen and what I've played, like, I dug the look. You know, it's not great, but it doesn't look terrible.
No, you have to think of the time that it was released, right? Because games of this era, you know, the polygon graphics still weren't quite there.
Yeah.
Like, we were starting, what they really should have done with this game was find a way to make it cel shaded. But, you know, obviously that wasn't something they thought of because it wasn't released that way. But you have these kind of anime inspired games, and then you have these kind of unattractive polygonal models, right? So, you know, a lot of games from this era, even after the PS1 era, the PS2 era looked way better.
Yeah.
The games are playable now in retrospect, but, you know, they still don't look super great.
Yeah.
So I think that might be people's issue with the graphics here.
Yeah.
They might be a little bit bland and so on and so forth, but for the time, I think they actually look pretty good.
Yeah.
I would have no issue playing it now. The cutscenes look great.
Yes.
So,
I mean, that's what it is. Like, you're 100% right. Like, this transition was just hard, not just on Fire Emblem, but on a lot of series. And I think this might be oversimplifying, but I think like the last, I want to say like 15 to 20 years of game evolution, I feel like has been trying to make the in-game graphics look as good as the cutscene graphics, like have that transition not be like insanely jarring.
Yes. Yeah, no, absolutely. And I mean, we're now living in an era where they've largely succeeded with that, right?
Yeah. Aside from this being the introduction of Ike, who I consider Mark, Roy, and Ike to be like the three big Fire Emblem protagonists until Awakening. This game generally received very well, though the sales were not as good as previous entries during their international release. This game, I think, now is incredibly sought after. I think it's like approaching, if not already, in that $100 range.
It's there
for what you're getting. So people have really like, even though at release it didn't sell very well, this is one of those games that people are now going back to and being like, this is a GameCube gem and we need to have it.
Yeah, pretty much. Especially with the overall popularity of Fire Emblem skyrocketing. It makes it pretty highly sought after. But yeah, it is the third worst selling Fire Emblem game in the entire series. Like, you can see this console generation, or generations, because the next one's on the Wii. But you can see this particular console generation was not kind to Fire Emblem.
Yeah. And I wonder, and this is just a quick aside, but I wonder, because I feel like a lot of the times those sorts of things, like declining sales numbers, are put on the games themselves. But you got to think, like, the GameCube was not commercially successful as a console. So obviously, the games aren't going to sell as much as the GBA games, because the GBA was insanely popular.
Oh, no, the install base was like 7-8 times more than the GameCube. Yeah.
So I feel like a lot of the decline that we see in some of these sales numbers, and I mean, my point is going to be immediately countered by the next game.
Yeah, exactly.
Are sort of, I think, to a certain degree, also fall on the shoulders of just the GameCube not being successful. But then we get Fire Emblem Radiant Dawn released on the Wii, which is the second most successful console ever released. And this one also didn't sell well, so what the hell do I know? But
the Wii is such an interesting console, because I think what you've got with the Wii is you have this huge install base of people who would not like a Fire Emblem game.
Yep.
Like they played Wii Sports. The system is cheaper than by far cheaper than the PS3, which was the main and the Xbox 360, which were the main competition at the time. So you have this huge install base of mom, dad, and young children, and Fire Emblem is just not for them, right?
Yep.
So the Wii is still an install base that's like 5 times larger.
Oh, yeah.
And you would expect, just based on those numbers, I guess if you're an optimist, that Radiant Dawn would sell 5 times as much as Path of Radiance. But no, it actually sold less than Path of Radiance.
So now I gotta know, because I don't know if it's coming up or not, but if Path of Radiance is the third worst and Radiant Dawn is the second worst, what is the worst selling Fire Emblem game?
Great question. I actually never looked up the answer to that. I will.
We'll cut this out of the podcast.
Just because now I can't let it go.
Okay.
But yeah, we'll find out in a second. But, and this Radiant Dawn, Path of Radiance, we're really kind of starting to see the death spiral of the series.
Yeah.
Like, the other issue, too, is that the GBA, you have a development team of 40 people at the most? It can't be that many. But when you go to console and you need far more staff to work on graphics and sound and all that stuff, the staff for Radiant Dawn was 200 people.
Yep.
That's huge.
And half of them, apparently, almost half of the staff was working on just the cutscenes.
Yeah, and rightfully so, dude. They look really good. But but I mean, even 100 people is still probably over twice as much as your average Game Boy game. So like, you know, even if Radiant Dawn and Path of Radiance sell the same amount of units, you know, it's still borderline unprofitable for Nintendo. Like it's starting to become a risky franchise.
Mm-hmm. And I think, and here's the thing within all of this, is that these games were still doing well, you know?
8s and 9s. 8s and 9s across the board. Absolutely.
There's not, throughout the history of the franchise, there really isn't a Fire Emblem game that critically did terribly. Like, some of them had mixed responses, but overall, like, the series is known for being a quality series and being games that, like, people put time and a lot of effort to make very good, which in a genre like strategy RPG, I think is extremely important because you're sinking so much time and so much investment into these games and these characters and doing all these missions that it has to be, you know, be that good or people will just drop it immediately.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, 100%, dude. Like, I think when you start seeing complaints about Fire Emblem, you'll start seeing complaints about certain aspects of the games.
Yeah.
And you'll also start seeing that when there are complaints, it kind of comes into step at the same time as the internet era coming up. You know, in the Super Famicom, Super Nintendo era, we don't have internet, and the people who complain just aren't as loud.
Yeah.
You know, like all you've got is magazines and the critics love it and we're good to go.
Yep.
But once, you know, you start having that really vocal minority and giving them a voice like, oh, we don't like this about Fire Emblem. Oh, we don't like, you know, lack of relationships.
Yep.
Man, I'm so disdainful of message boards. But, you know, that's when you start seeing stuff like, oh, people complained about this and people complained about that. You know, it's just part and parcel with the era. It doesn't mean basically what I'm saying is that it doesn't mean the games are bad.
No.
The games were still excellent. Path of Radiance and Radiant Dawn, very well reviewed, excellent games. But yeah, just for whatever reason, just didn't sell.
Yeah. And here's the other thing is they make up, both of these games are sort of, they're tied to each other, like incredibly so, because they're a duology. Like Radiant Dawn is direct sequel to Path of Radiance, which wasn't really that common for this series. So I think that the people who did play these games, like the people who did play Path of Radiance and Radiant Dawn, really really love these games because it's sort of a story that they followed from one console to the next. And like we've talked about before, like when you play these games, you get so invested in the characters and the story. So I feel like this is one of those games that, you know, both of these are incredibly expensive now, not produced in high volume numbers, but the people that play them really, really, really like them.
Yeah, and rightfully so. Although, funnily enough, with Radiant Dawn, we mentioned 8s and 9s across the board.
Oh, yeah.
Radiant Dawn, not quite. There's it's so bizarre. There's such a weird translation error, like a very simple translation error in Radiant Dawn that did not help it critically. Like the review's still very good overall.
Yeah.
But as anybody who's a veteran now of the Fire Emblem series knows, the Fire Emblem series nowadays generally has 3 difficulty settings: normal, hard, and lunatic. Radiant Dawn mistranslated easy, normal, and hard. Oh man. So you have people, you know, and most people are going to start on normal, I would think.
That's what I was going to say is this is very applicable to me because I'm that guy. Like every RPG, every game I play, I'm normal all the time.
And sometimes I'll even go hard. Like if it's a series that I'm familiar with, right? Like Etrian Odyssey, for example, I don't play on normal anymore. And same thing with Fire Emblem, like when I play it on the 3DS, but that's a whole other thing we'll get to in a moment.
Yeah.
But yeah, crazy. Like you read some of these reviews and people are like, this game's awesome. The story is great. And holy shit, it's hard.
It destroyed my will to live, but the story was delightful.
Yeah, exactly. And the story is like,
Yeah.
you know, you mentioned it's a direct sequel to Path of Radiance, but that whole part of it doesn't really take place until I think the third act, which is when Ike comes back as a character.
I think this was, you're right, and I'm glad you pointed that out, because I think it's important to note, like, Fire Emblem has been really good, I think, generally about being accessible to players at any point to jump in story-wise. Maybe not mechanically, but I think you could pick up any Fire Emblem game and play it and enjoy your experience. You know, like, obviously you benefit from playing more of them by learning more about characters and stuff, but it's not a game where, like, there's no required reading in Fire Emblem for the most part.
Right. Yeah. No, good job, Intelligent Systems. Like, they've managed to do that thing where your experience is enhanced by having played the previous games, but certainly is not necessary. They've straddled that line really well.
Yeah.
I'm very impressed.
So that's pretty much, you know, like we were saying, the Path of Radiance and Radiant Dawn, excellent games, deserve to be played. Unfortunately, were not played very much and saw declining sales. And that leads us to Fire Emblem Shadow Dragon. This is my entry into Fire Emblem. So I like Shadow Dragon. Shadow Dragon is cool. Especially because it is a remake of the first game. So it's a full remake of the first game. It was released in 2008, pretty much everywhere. 2008 in Japan and Europe, and then 2009 in North America and Australia. So a real reversal of fortune there, where Europe got a game before we did.
Way to go, pal. Way to go, pal territory. You got one.
That's right. And they got a good one.
They did.
And here's the thing is, remake of the original, Yuka Sugiyoko returns to supervise the soundtrack. So she makes her triumphant return for a game that I feel like must have been kind of special for her, because it's a remake of the first game. So you're sort of returning to an old friend. This is what I'd like to think it was like coming back to this. And I gotta say, like, this was my entry into Fire Emblem, and I really enjoyed this. Like, it has the benefit of, you know, implementing the mechanics that have sort of evolved thus far, but none of it feels overwhelming. And I think, you know, when Nintendo first brought Fire Emblem to, you know, outside of Japan, they did a really good job of, like, implementing tutorials that weren't overly annoying, but were definitely incredibly helpful in, like, helping players figure all this out. So if you knew, like, if you had played any previous strategy RPGs, this wasn't super foreign to you, and it wasn't overwhelming or scary, because when I started playing this, like, my past experience was Advance Wars. That was it. And this was immediately super different. Like I talked about before, like, I hadn't had to deal with permadeath. I hadn't had to deal with caring about characters, but Shadow Dragon does a really good job of, like, introducing all that in a really, like, fun, accessible way, and really gets you, like, interested in Fire Emblem right away. So I have mad props for this game.
Yeah, I think it's an excellent remake. And, you know, with the Super Famicom games, for example, like, there's an aesthetic there where we talk about them.
Yeah.
And, man, working on this show, look, I love the Region Free Gamers podcast. We work hard on it, and I think we release a good show. I'm proud of it. It's a lot of fun. I hate the Region Free Gamers podcast because every time we research these games, I'm like, I want to own all of it.
Yep.
And my wallet is like, no, Paul, don't. And I'm like, shut up.
Fire Emblem's really going to hurt you, because this is also, again, extremely expensive now, especially for a DS game.
Yeah, for a Nintendo DS game, it is pretty expensive. I do have this one, so I'm thankful for that. But, like, the nice thing about Shadow Dragon is that those 8-bit NES games, I have no interest now. Yeah. Like, most I would say most 8-bit games, like, you know, barring something like a Sweet Home or Lagrange Point, or like even River City Ransom. Like, I know a lot of people who discovered River City Ransom as adults.
Okay.
Like, those games are still interesting, where I still want to play them. But for the most part, I just have no time for a new 8-bit game.
Yeah.
But 16-bit, that aesthetic, you know, and there's just enough complexity now to those games where I could go back and play them. But Shadow Dragon now, I don't have to go back to the 8-bit at all.
That's right.
If I want to play the OG Fire Emblem. And props to Intelligent Systems for including the guidance scenarios in there as well.
Yep.
It's really just it's just a complete product.
Yep.
I have all day for it.
It's one of these releases that sort of, I think, accentuates like why remakes are a thing that should happen sometimes, because this makes it so you, like you said, you just don't have to go back, and it includes more things that previously weren't available and just puts it all in like one easy package. And, you know, this is like, if you hand somebody this, it's like, this is all you need. Like, go play it, you know?
Yeah.
Don't worry about anything else in the series. Like, here you go. Here's a starting point. Go. And Fire Emblem has always been really good about that. Better than Advance Wars has been, even though Advance Wars, like, the focus on story isn't there. So you could jump into any Advance Wars, but I feel like there's a more direct progression there where, like, you benefit from playing Advance Wars 1 before playing 2, before playing Dual Strike.
Yeah.
Whereas in Fire Emblem, it's like, jump in, have a great time.
The only knock on Shadow Dragon, and to be fair, it is, you know, a reason I make fun of the message board people.
Yeah.
But Shadow Dragon, no relationship system.
Nope.
In it. And that really annoyed a lot of people. And I think I might agree with those, with the angry nerds.
See, here's the thing, is to me, I get that that's like a huge Fire Emblem thing. I'm not a huge like guy into that system. Like, I think it's cool and I think it's executed very well when they do it, but I don't need it. Which is surprising because I'm a huge, like that sort of dating sim aspect. Like, when it works for me, it really works for me. But in my strategy RPGs, I'm like, I got enough shit to worry about with like equipping things and leveling people up and classes. I don't need to like read through a novel's worth of text exchanges between all these characters.
All right. So in summary, before we take our break, what I've learned, Arnie just likes to kill. He doesn't like relationships. Good to go, Arnie. Are we good for a break here?
I think we are good for a break.
All right. When we come back, we're gonna start with the awakening of Fire Emblem. It's gonna be awesome.
Oh, I see what you did there.
All right, everyone, and we're back. And a couple things, actually, before we move on to Awakening, which is what everybody's been waiting for. We mentioned the worst-selling game in the series. I can't believe that I forgot it was Thracia 776. You know, for a game released only in Japan in in the year 2000 for a system that was like, 9-10 years old?
Yep.
Those late-era games, I mean, there's a reason they're expensive as they are. So Thracia 776, the worst selling game in the series. And we can't forget as well, after Shadow Dragon, for the Nintendo DS, Japan only New Mystery of the Emblem, basically a remake of the Super Famicom game. Fan translations are out there, you can patch it. So if you're interested in playing the Super Famicom Mystery of the Emblem, maybe the DS one is the way to go. It's tough
The
to
DS
say.
one,
I
I think the DS one is definitely the way to go. Like, we touched on it briefly when we were actually talking about Mystery of the Emblem, about how angry it made me that it's been released so many fucking times. But yeah, it looks like to me, like, New Mystery of the Emblem is sort of the Shadow Dragon equivalent for Mystery of the Emblem. So I think that that's the way to go if you want to play it with, like, everything included and, like, you know, all the content you can handle. And I think that's the one that includes the Satellaview content as well for BS Fire Emblem. So
yes, correct.
Go play that one.
By the way, I can't look at BS Fire Emblem without thinking it's bullshit Fire Emblem.
Yes,
every time I see that in the outline, I'm like, haha, bullshit Fire Emblem.
We are children, Paul.
Oh my god, I'm like 40 going on 8. It's ridiculous.
Listen, I'm not going to pretend this wasn't the episode where I made 2 420 jokes.
All right, we're already going off the rails here.
Yeah.
Fire Emblem Awakening. This is kind of the big one, right? Like,
I'm assuming that you've inserted some sort of sweeping score behind you as you say that name.
God damn it, dude! You keep giving me more editing work. Like, you're always the one who brings up adding music, and I'm like,
yes.
Son of a bitch, Arnie, like, you're not doing any of this editing. But anyhow, Awakening. So, Fire Emblem Shadow Dragon, and then New Mystery of the Emblem. Sales-wise, again, kind of underwhelming. We're talking about sales numbers very similar to the DS versions of Advance Wars. Yeah. So, you know, not terrible. Actually, no, Dual Strike was just outright terrible as far as the numbers are concerned. But Shadow Dragon and New Mystery of the Emblem, like, Intelligent Systems is like, man, what are we doing wrong here, right? Like, these games, they're, you know, there's definitely a fan base for them, but we can't seem to crack the code. Yeah. And at this time, Nintendo's running out of patience, and Nintendo comes to Intelligent Systems and says, okay, guys, you've got one more. Wrap it up, right? This is going to be the last Fire Emblem game, whether it's a success or whether it's a failure. But we need you guys to try your best. Gambate, Intelligent Systems. and do your best and release the best possible Fire Emblem game that you can. Arnie, holy shit, they sure did, didn't they?
I mean, the sales goal that apparently Nintendo set was 250,000 units. Less than that, you're done. More than that, we'll see.
Yeah.
Because I'm sure they didn't promise them anything.
No, they crushed it. Like, this game... So this game was released in Japan on April 19th of 2012. Like, come on, guys.
Yeah. Not nice.
Who's showing up early for Stoner Day, honestly? And then it's released in North America. It's released in the West, North America, Europe, Australia, in 2013. And again, like we said, you know, sales numbers just, like, absolutely crushed it. We're talking over 2 million units worldwide for a game that... And to be fair, the Japanese sales target was 250,000 Japan only, not necessarily worldwide.
Oh, gotcha.
That would have been a very modest number for, you know, worldwide, right? Mm-hmm. But even still, they crushed it in Japan, and then it was released in the West. And I think what ended up happening was, you know, because they crushed it in Japan, Nintendo's like, wow, we have something here. And then they promoted the crap out of it in the West.
Now, let me ask you this, Paul.
There you go, right?
Let me ask you this, because I'm curious about this. This game was released fairly close to the 3DS launch, or no?
You know what? Man, why are you asking me questions that I'm unprepared for?
Well, the reason
what am I, a politician?
The reason that I ask is because I picked this up when I first bought my 3DS. This will give you a little bit more insight about the kind of person I am. I bought a 3DS, and then the 2 games that I bought with it were Fire Emblem Awakening and Shin Megami Tensei Devil Survivor Overclocked. So there was a theme.
Yes.
I was not part of those declining sales. I was all in on turn-based strategy RPGs. But the reason that I wonder that is because I remember when I bought both of them, I was like, these are the two, like, of all the games I saw on the shelf, I was like, these are the two, like, really big games. You know, obviously you have, like, I'm sure there was, like, a Mario, and the Luigi's Mansion, I think, was fairly close to launch as well. But those were the two games that I was like, these look like big budget, like, the games that I want to play, you know?
Yeah.
So I wonder if, you know, obviously Awakening is, at least to me, incredible game, but it looked like, even the look of it on the shelf was just like immediately jumps out at you, and I'm wondering if that's partly because it was released closer to when the library wasn't as robust as it is now.
That's definitely a possibility. It was now that I've actually been looking at it. It was released roughly a year after the 3DS launch, so you know, still a fairly early cycle game.
Yeah.
But and that's probably a reason, but like honestly, I think the reason for the success is just they took every single aspect of Fire Emblem and made it either a little bit better or a lot better. Like this is the one where they had the master plan and it just came together perfectly. They have new art direction, which I think is a huge deal because that Fire Emblem Awakening and then Fates and so on, the artwork is amazing. Yeah. Toshiyuki Kusakihara and Yusuke Kozaki. Yusuke Kozaki is the main guy, the main character designer responsible for, you know, for that art, for that feel that Awakening has. And, you know, just a little bit more appealing, right? Like the characters, you know, they have like a little bit more of an Asian tinge to them, less cartoony, but still, you know, look great. Yeah. You know, they have virtually every system that matters from previous Fire Emblem games brought in, right? They have the weapons triangle. They have, you know, the huge maps. You have the relationships, like the side story kind of interactions between the characters and between missions. Yeah. You know, the characters are all colorful and well thought out, charmingly written. You know, like I look at a character like Kellum, you know, the big tank dude. Yeah. That guy is begging to be boring. Absolutely. And in Fire Emblem Awakening, they make him super charming, you know, with his whole like sneaking up on people and like, oh my God, it's Kellum. Like, you know, just, they really did well. Like the first I'm not going to say it's the first Fire Emblem with voice, but they did a really cool thing with the voice because this game has so much text. Oh, yeah. If you fully voice all the text in this game, I finished Awakening in about 40 hours, roughly. Yeah. If this game was fully voiced, we're talking like Persona levels now. It would have been easily like playing. About 100 hours. Yeah, exactly. So what they did in Awakening is they did this cool thing where you have kind of voice bites. So you have like a dialogue box, and sometimes the dialogue box is accompanied by a small voice bite from the character. They say like a couple of words from the dialogue, or they make a noise. Like Donald. Oh my God. Donald's like, every once in a while, Donald goes, hoo-wee. And it's just like, it's hilarious. He's got this hick voice. It's adorable. So, yeah, you know, there's so many little things that they did for this one. You were going to say. Well, yeah, I was going to say, like, exactly what you're saying is, you know, I Shadow Dragon was my entry point, and I really like that game. But Awakening really just gives each and every character just such a distinct personality, and they're sort of their own unique character. You know what I mean? Like, there's no confusing, like, by the time you're really invested in this game, you'll never confuse two characters. Even if their sprites look slightly similar, like, you'll know what makes each of these characters that character. And I kind of hate it because it makes the permadeath so much worse. Yeah. I have to admit, when I first played this game, I did have the permadeath turned on. Yeah. You know, kind of a controversial thing. We're going to have casual mode instead of permadeath. Yep. Not the first time Intelligent Systems did that with Fire Emblem. But look, let's not kid ourselves. You have to have casual mode in these games, right? Like, you're going to turn off a whole bunch of potential customers. And I just, like, I don't get it, dude. I don't get why people complain about taking permadeath out. Because you have the option there.
Yeah.
If you want it, play it, right? Like, what's the big deal? But
yeah,
I digress.
I agree with you. Like, I think you need to have some sort of mode without permadeath, because it's not like permadeath is the norm for these types of games either. You know, like, some games do implement it, but a lot of games don't. So even if somebody is a fan of this genre of game, if they're not used to that aspect of it, it can be really, really intimidating. And the fact that, like, you know, you always have the option to reload. And some games I know, like, I think Radiant Dawn even included, like, a quick save system, so you can save, like, during battles and stuff. But when you have a character that dies and you've put so much time, effort into developing them, leveling them, equipping them, and then late game they just die, like, and you're, I don't know, 2 hours into a mission, you don't, like, having to turn that game off to reload and having to do all that again. Like, I can't tell you how many strategy RPGs I've played up until pretty much the last mission, and then, like, I just can't beat it, or one of my characters dies and I have to restart, and I just never turn that game on again.
Yeah, I think you need to believe in yourself, Arnie. You can do this.
I need to stop being such a scrub and just do it. You're
just
right.
Get good. Just get good. And conversely, like, with permadeath, you have Ozzy's experience, right? Because Ozzy played this game a while ago. He loved it.
Yeah.
But early in the game, there's the mission where you rescue Donald. Yep. And he wasn't able to, and Donald died.
That happened to me.
And then it happened to you too. Holy shit. So you guys missed out on this character who is hilarious.
Oh no, I restarted.
Okay, good. Thank goodness. I mean, he's wearing a pot. He's got a pot on his head. Like, come on.
He's the best.
Yeah, and so Ozzy kind of unfortunately missed out on the Donald experience, which is, you know, kind of central to Fire Emblem Awakening as far as I'm concerned. This game was actually codenamed Fire Emblem Finn. Knowing that it was going to be the last one, but they didn't share that code name with the public. Yeah. And when it did come time to choose a new title for the game, they gave it something that was almost completely opposite, which was Fire Emblem Awakening, which was really cool. You know, kind of pushing the point home that this is a borderline reimagining of the series, but really they're just kind of including everything. Yeah. It's a remarkable achievement that they were able to basically resurrect this franchise with one game. Yeah. I mean, what do you think? Like, what do you think is the main factor that made it so popular? Like, is it a system? Is it the design?
You know, personally, and this is gonna, I feel like this is gonna be a cop-out answer, but I don't think there is just the one thing. I think that, you know, obviously, it's just a really good game. And I'd like to think that people just recognize quality when they see it. Because to me, like I said before, this game, and you mentioned this too, the art for this game is just amazing. Like, when you put this game on a shelf, it just jumps out at you. Like, I could not help but be, like, immediately drawn to this game. Even though I hadn't played a Fire Emblem game for years, I was like, I need this game. And then once you get into it, like, once it sort of gets you to open the door, it just, like, busts it wide open. And it does the thing that we've been talking about before, and I think we talk about this a lot on this show, is that it took what was good about the older entries and it refined them to make them better. You had said before that it sort of takes so many different systems from all, you know, these different games. It was kind of meant to be the ultimate Fire Emblem.
Really was.
And it succeeded in that, because it's not only that it has all these systems, but they're integrated seamlessly. Like, they're very intuitive and they're very fun. And I think that's the most important thing, is that when you have a game like this that could easily, I feel like in the wrong hands, this game could have been a disaster. Because I feel like this game could have easily been overly complicated, kind of muddled, and, you know, like with a story like this complex that involves time travel and generations and, you know, all this insane shit. Like, I feel like if Intelligent Systems didn't do things just right, this game could have been horrible. But they managed to find that balance. And I think that's what ultimately makes this like such a good game. That
I agree.
Whether you're a veteran of the series from the first game or you're just coming into Fire Emblem right now, this game is easily accessible and, you know, is easily understandable and is easily you're able to pick it up and play it and feel good about what you're doing right away.
Yeah. And it should be noted, like, it was really close to not being the kind of game that it is. Like, you had, after Radiant Dawn, you had Intelligent Systems working on a new Fire Emblem game. I think they had design documents. I don't think they ever got to a tech demo, but like, the next Fire Emblem game after Radiant Dawn on the Wii was going to be a straight up RPG. You know, they were actually working on this for quite a while. Eventually it did get canceled. Yeah. You know, possibly has to do with Radiant Dawn's numbers. Who knows, right? But when they were talking about Awakening, everything was on the table, right? And the fact that they kind of kept it classic, but included everything they possibly could, I think it's safe to say that was the right choice, yeah?
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm glad we agree, and I'm glad that the 2 million units and hundreds of thousands of DLC units agree with us as well.
Exactly. Like, that's the thing is, it's always fun to talk about these games, but at the end of the day, it's like, what can you really say? You know, like, obviously the game's not perfect. Personally, there are things in it that I might not enjoy as much as other people, but like overall as a package, it's just a good game.
Absolutely, man. Like you said, not perfect. I think the story is a little bit disjointed. It's really kind of rescued by the characters that are really cool. But anyway, we're not gonna start picking apart Awakening. Great game. If you haven't played it, go play it. Super charming. And you know, it's 7 years old now, so I think we're starting to kind of reach the point where we can call it iconic, you know, without sounding too, you know, hyperbolic. Anyway, moving on, Fire Emblem Fates. So, like you said, Arnie, Awakening was supposed to be the last one no matter what. Or maybe I said that. One of us said it. Who cares? And so Intelligent Systems was like, all right, sweet. You know, we're good here. And Nintendo was like, oh, not so fast, guys. We have ourselves a cash cow here. It's time to milk this thing. We want you, Intelligent Systems, to bring us a bigger, better, and excellent selling Fire Emblem game.
Isn't that just the fucking way when it's like, this is the last one. We're going to put literally everything we have into this game. We're going to destroy ourselves just to make it the ultimate Fire Emblem experience so everybody is happy. And then it's like, oh, cool, it worked. Now we want you to do that again, but better.
Yeah, no, that's typical, like, corporate. You know, that's everything. Oh, you met your quota? Haha, here's a bigger one. So anyway, Fate's a wildly ambitious project. Really, when you think about it, the scope is it's just ridiculous, right? Yeah. So Fire Emblem Fates to be released as 3 games with a story that runs concurrent with each other. Birthright follows the good Kingdom of Hoshido. Conquest follows the bad Kingdom of Nor, and then Revelation kind of ties both of them together. This was released 3 years after Awakening, which, you know, kind of shows you how deep the development cycle was. A lot of the gameplay mechanics of Awakening return. Nothing was taken out as far as I know. Which
I think is interesting, like as a concept, just like, obviously the stories are going to be different, but having them sort of each be slightly their own thing, like they're not equally hard, they're not, you know, they sort of have their particular quirks about them, but also not making a distinction for people about which one's the hard one and which one's the easy one. Like, I can imagine people picking up Conquest and just being like, what the fuck, man? Like, you know?
Oh, yeah, no, for sure, man. In any case, for for Fates, again, critically praised, commercially very successful.
Yep.
Similar sales numbers to Awakening, so the franchise is still strong. Musically, even they're like, you know what? These 3DS games, they're their own thing. They brought in new staff to do the music. The game has a theme song by Hiroki Morishita, Lost in Thoughts All Alone. Anybody who's played the game knows exactly which one I'm talking about.
Yeah, I mean, I liked it because I think it sounds like cool ass RPG music, like the same way I like the Kingdom Hearts songs and and the Persona songs. Like, it's just dope.
Yeah, man, it really is, right? And it's a fitting theme for the game.
Yeah.
This is the first Fire Emblem game, and I touched on this earlier, where you are the main character. Like,
yes.
your avatar is actually the character whom the entire story revolves around. Which is a very interesting thing. Obviously, you can pick male or female as the main character, which is awesome. Again, critically successful. This one, though, perhaps the fans didn't like as much as Awakening. I tend to agree. The story is a little bit weird. Because you have a good kingdom and an evil kingdom, and one character who kind of ties it all together. The decisions that the characters make are just a little bit not quite there.
Yeah.
There's a weird not subplot, but like there's a weird incestual thing going on between the main character in Conquest and Camilla, his older sister.
Yes, I had heard about this.
Yeah, but like in the game, it's okay because they're not blood relatives. I don't know, man. It's a little weird. Like, and spoiler alert for Game of Thrones fans here, but like when Jon Snow found out Dany was his aunt, it's over, right? Jon Snow is like, all right, I'm out. You know, we can't do this anymore.
No, it was.
But in Fire Emblem, it's like intriguing.
Whoa, you say?
Yeah, exactly. So more Lannister than Stark is what we'll say. This one is.
I will say of Fates, like, you touched on it too, and I think I was not aware of this until I started doing research for this, that this is like a more divisive game amongst the fan base. But I think it makes sense. You know, I think that Fire Emblem has always been big on story, and the bigger and bolder you go, the more likely it is that, you know, it's just not going to come together. But like, trying to tie together 3 separate games is something that I think was insanely ambitious to begin with. And the fact that they even slightly stuck the landing, I think, earns high marks from me personally.
Yes, I agree with that. Like, I might have issues with some parts of it.
Yeah.
But you're right. They stuck the landing, you know, maybe a little bobble. Yeah. But they got it, and they definitely deserve props for that. Very ambitious project. And, you know, I talk about the fans, it being sort of a divisive game, but like, even in development, right? Yeah. This is the first Fire Emblem game where they have a team that is not necessarily working all together. Like, the amount of people working on Fates compared to Awakening, gigantic, hundreds. And they started siloing the people off. And so you kind of have this, now it's not as pronounced, but you kind of have this Final Fantasy 15 effect where the game feels just kind of a little bit disjointed. It doesn't feel quite as cohesive as Awakening. At least that's what I found. And then in doing research for this episode, I'm like, all right, okay, yeah, this makes a little more sense now in that you have these development units, like the music unit and the art direction unit and the gameplay unit and so on and so forth. And yeah, they're talking to each other, but once you start doing that, you know, you kind of run the risk of, you know, certain scenarios feeling different than others and certain stories feeling different and so on. And that definitely happens here. And even, you know, this was a tortured game as far as development is concerned, even though, like you said, they stuck the landing. Yeah. The other thing that divided them up, the fan service aspect. There were a lot of people in the development team who just were not a fan of people like boobs. Let's throw in more boobs. Oh, and hey, let's throw in a weird mini game where you rub the characters on your touch screen, right? Like, I'm not gonna lie, I'm glad they removed that from the Western versions.
Yeah.
Like, to me, it's just like, there are parts in Fates where like you add accessories to your characters and you dress them differently.
Yeah.
And you can strip them down to their underwear and like move the camera around. Okay. You can just choose to ignore that, right? Like that's an accessory thing. It's not really in the game. But I mean, when you have the relationship building, that's integral to the game.
Yeah, when you sort of force stuff like that on players, it's a little dicier.
Yeah, it's not quite as great.
Yeah.
So, that was another thing. I think the final product, and I mean, you kind of groaned when I said, the rubbing game and more boobs. If it was, this was like the compromise, I think. They probably even wanted more of that. So, again,
true.
like torture development, the product we got in the end was pretty good. The other interesting thing about Fates, lastly, is the castle. There's a My Castle system in the game that they add to this one. And let me tell you, dude, My Castle, it adds so much more replay value to this game. Like, whatever issues you might have with the story or you find it uninteresting, you can just play My Castle and you have online PvP. By the way,
oh, nice.
I tried the online PvP once.
Yeah.
Dude, I would have had an easier time dunking on fucking 2012 LeBron James than beating this guy in PvP. The matchmaking in Fire Emblem PvP, like, what are we doing here? I lasted like 2 seconds.
Oh my god.
And I'm pretty sure the person I was playing against probably got annoyed that I didn't just quit.
Yeah.
I forced them to like kill all my characters and I ran. I was so bitter. But yeah, it's got online PvP. You can visit other people's castles.
Oh, nice.
You can cultivate your castle.
Okay.
So that you grow fruits and vegetables and you mine different ores. And then with those ores, you can enhance your weapons or feed your army before a fight to give them bonuses.
Oh, sweet.
Really cool.
So it adds all this stuff, but it's also like, it has gameplay implications. Like, if you want to dedicate yourself to doing that, then you get rewarded for it, basically.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Like, you halfway through the game, you could probably just drop the story altogether. Although, I mean, you do get XP, but
yeah,
you can get, you can get DLC to get, more XP and stuff like that.
Okay.
But yeah, you can really just focus on My Castle and collecting more skills for your characters by visiting other people, and it's really, really cool. And borderline, like, very distracting, actually.
It sounds like you basically dropped the story to play this, like, side thing for hours.
Yeah, for like 10 hours at a time. It was ridiculous. It added way more time to this game for me personally, but in any case. Yep. So yeah, that's Fire Emblem Fates in a nutshell. A little bit of the development there and the reception.
Yep.
And I don't know, Arnie, I think we should take a break. Like, is there anything else you wanted to add there?
Nope, I think I'm good.
All right, cool, man. So when we come back, we'll wrap it up with Fire Emblem Echoes and Heroes and Three Houses.
Sounds good.
Alrighty, and we're back. And wrapping up the series now. We've gone a little bit long. I don't know how we went long, Arnie. There's only 16 Fire Emblem games.
I mean, you would think that the people that literally cannot talk about anything for less than 2.5 hours would have reined it in for one of the longest running strategy RPG series of all time. But
you'd think,
surprise, here we are.
Somehow we've managed to go on for a little bit longer than we expected. So we'll wrap it up. Fire Emblem Echoes, Shadows of Valentia, released on the 3DS. This is the last Fire Emblem game on the 3DS.
Yep.
This is basically, a remake of Gaiden. for the Famicom. Am I wrong here?
No. And this is what makes me these kinds of things like bring a smile to my face, in that there must have been some board meeting where a bunch of really important people sat down and they were like, well, we now have an incredibly successful franchise that we've brought back from the dead. What do we do next? And they're like, let's remake a 1992 Famicom game that is already considered to be the black sheep of the series, and release it.
But you know what, man? They did it. It's successful, right? Like I was gonna say they didn't just re-release Gaiden, like they remade it, right? Yeah. Like all the gameplay rebuilt from the ground up. They used the technology from Fates and Awakening. Yep. You know, Fates and Awakening, the incredible cutscenes, which I didn't even mention when we were talking about those. Like those cutscenes were fantastic. You know, all that stuff is brought back for Echoes. And again, critical commercial success. Fire Emblem keeps on rolling. Yep. I've spoken with some people. For them, this is their favorite of the 3DS games.
Well, here's the thing, is that they did something that I thought was brave, really, is that they released these two games beforehand, incredibly successful. Then they release this, and they completely eliminate the weapons triangle and the marriage system. Yeah. Which are like integral parts of Fire Emblem up to that point. But it made sense because it was based on Gaiden, and Gaiden didn't have those things. Integrating those mechanics into the story would have just changed way too much about the game.
Especially marriage.
Yeah, absolutely. So they did add the support system, but I feel like for people, like, if you're a person who really enjoys, like, that aspect of Fire Emblem, not having it here is probably a huge turnoff. That being said, like, I've found the same thing that you have, is that this is generally regarded as the best 3DS Fire Emblem release.
Yeah, that's the general regard.
Yeah.
So moving on from Echoes... Man, I hate to gloss over it, but boy, oh boy, did we ever take our time with this one. Moving on from Echoes, I think a deserved shout out to Fire Emblem Heroes, Intelligent Systems mobile game based on the Fire Emblem franchise. I think it's a really cool game. I only downloaded it and played it briefly, but very, very light on story and very, very heavy on just giving the people what they want, which is all the characters that you can fit from the Fire Emblem series into a mobile game. And, I didn't get into it personally because it's a mobile game and, you know, there's going to be microtransactions and kind of randomized. Like, when you get new characters, you don't necessarily always get the ones you want.
Yep.
And I just, I don't really have too much time for that myself. But as an exercise in expanding the franchise, very successful and just really cool to have a game where you can just have all the characters, I think.
Absolutely. I think that's a lot of people, that'd be their dream scenario, is just having, actual fully fledged Fire Emblem game where you could just play as all the characters, which would be insane. But Intelligent Systems has done so many insane things up to this point that who the hell knows?
Hey man, you get Masahiro Sakurai to work on that one. Because...
And you finally...
He's the master of bringing all the characters together, God. Smash Bros.
That poor man.
Maybe he can do the same thing for Smash, or maybe he can do the same thing for strategy RPGs that he did for fighting games. Fetch me my quill, Arnie. I'm going to write them a
letter. Get your Raven out of the lockbox.
Anyhow, Fire Emblem Heroes, like I said, quick mention.
Yep.
Moving on, Three Houses, finally. This is the game that basically inspired us to do the episode, to be released July 2019. I don't know. Have you seen very many previews for this game? I am hyped for it.
I haven't watched a whole lot, mostly because I don't want to get too hyped for it because I still don't own a Switch, and I feel like this game would tempt me to go out and buy one. I probably will anyway. But what I have seen...
Dude, I'm going to spam you with previews.
what I have seen, I'm super excited for. Like, I'm hype.
Yeah, I really like the fact that, you know, the one kind of incongruent thing about every Fire Emblem game to this point is that they are trying to depict these very large scale conflicts.
Yeah.
But it's just single commanders fighting each other. And it never, you know, thematically, it never quite made sense to me. But Three Houses, you have, you know, commanders and battalions of units. And to me, this is always kind of, at least visually, this is always kind of the Fire Emblem game that I think I always wanted.
Yeah.
Now, when I say stuff like that, this is like hoping for a Raptors win. Again, I'm just setting myself up for disappointment. But with that said, you know, what can I say, dude? It looks really good. They've brought back a lot of the team that worked on Fates and Awakening, specifically the art direction. Working with Koei actually jointly on this one as well, which is a very interesting little quirk.
Yeah.
They also worked with Koei on the Fire Emblem Warriors series.
That's right.
So yeah, I'm pretty interested to see what's going to happen with this one. I'm reasonably certain that this summer we're going to have a What Have You Been Playing episode, and I'm reasonably certain that we're going to talk about Three Houses at that time.
I mean, I would almost guarantee it. Yeah, like you said, like, I agree with you. Like, I think the fact that you're finally going to get to see, like, a little more visual representation of these, like, gigantic conflicts that this series has, I feel like they've always wanted to do something like this because their stories are so epic in scope that for the visuals to finally match, like, their intentions with these games is going to be, I think, a sight to behold.
I think so too. I think it's a very logical step for the series, and I think the technology is there. Mm-hmm. And oh man, I hope it doesn't suck. Well, I really hope it doesn't suck.
I'm also curious because, you know, I've already made my position clear that I view Fire Emblem as a handheld franchise. And with the Switch, you obviously have that, you know, flexibility where you can play it on the go or you can play it at home. But it's going to be a return to console for the series pretty much since Radiant Dawn. Yeah. So I'm also interested to see, you know, if what was good and what people enjoyed about Fates and Awakening will still be enjoyable in Three Houses.
Yeah, I'm very curious to see that as well because you've got, like you said, you've got increased scope. So maybe kind of storylines or relationships take a little bit of a backseat, but I think not. It appears that in the game you can walk around an academy and talk to the characters and visit different locations and so on and so forth. Yeah. So, you know, I hope that they realize that is kind of an integral part of the experience and that it's included. And yeah, ordinarily I'm not one to watch trailers for movies or demo gameplay for games. I like to kind of go into it, you know, untouched. Can't help myself, dude. Can't help myself for Fire Emblem. I'm weak. I'm a weak man.
It's just too much, man. It's just too much. It's carrying the torch for the turn-based strategy RPGs. Like, I feel like it's. I have to guess it's the longest running one at this point since Advance Wars has sort of gone away. And it feels nice to see it still doing what it does.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's kind of the legacy here is, you know, it's the longest one. It's Fire Emblem is now the torchbearer. Watching its development over the years and researching it, man, it's so cool seeing how we have like a couple times where it almost dies. And then you have these people come together and they release great versions of a beloved franchise. I'm glad it's still here. You know, I hope they don't beat it to death. But I'm still pretty glad it's here. Yeah. And, you know, props to Intelligent Systems for releasing a kick-ass series.
Absolutely. And I think, you know, seeing how the series has sort of ebbed and flowed, how it's evolved, you know, all the hardships that went into creating like the series that so many people love now, you know, it's so interesting to look back and see, you know, like, it wasn't just a point A to point B for Fire Emblem. You know, they took a lot of circuitous routes to get to where they are right now. And like understanding that and really diving into that is just so cool. And it really has given me like a new appreciation for the series.
Yeah. And for the anime.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely for the anime.
Absolutely for the anime.
That needs a remake ASAP. I want somebody to pick that up. I want Netflix to pick it up and go to town on it.
Yeah, for sure. But keep the same dubbing. Keep the same dubbing.
Yeah. I want to ask you, Paul, really quick before we close out, and I think we've already answered this question, but what is your favorite Fire Emblem game?
No, there's no question. It's Awakening,
okay.
Right? Like,
see,
yeah, it's got to be.
Same answer.
Same for you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
We're so fucking boring.
All right. On that note, this is the Region Free Gamers podcast. We're so fucking boring. But in all seriousness, everybody, thanks again for listening.
Yes.
And thanks for sticking with us. And hey, as always, rating and review, 5 stars.
Yep.
Really would help us out. It'd be awesome.
Yep.
And
find us on Instagram, Twitter.
Yeah. We can find us on Instagram at Region Free Gamers Podcast.
And on Twitter at Region Free Gamer.
Absolutely. Yeah, this has been fun. Thanks a lot, everyone.
Have a good one.
I hit it! Dogga, did you see that shot?
You're still too slow.
What did you say? I hit it on the mark!